So with with this brief introduction, I'd like to say that there are students joining from two programs, anthropology and political science. So I'd like to hand over this session to Dr. Yala. Thank you.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope I am audible. Yes, can somebody confirm that? All right. It's good to see all of you after quite a long time, and especially to see you on this special Skepseis occasion. And it is my privilege to introduce Dr. Sophia Chao. Dr. Sophie is a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Sydney School of Philosophical and Historical Inquiry. She received her PhD in anthropology from Macquarie University in 2019, which is also in Australia, and holds an MSc in anthropology and a BA in Oriental Studies, both from the University of Oxford. Dr. Sophia's upcoming book is titled In the Shadows of the Palms, More Than Human Becomings in West Papua. And this will be out in 2022, and so with Duke University Press. Not every one of you may have heard about Duke University Press, but perhaps this is the most prestigious university press in the world. Very few scholars are able to get published there, but Dr. Sophia is one of them, which tells us already quite a bit about her scholarship. So I'm incredibly pleased that Dr. Sophia accepted the invitation by Skepseis to be with all of us today. I'm pleased, first of all, because Dr. Sophie's work is cutting edge in offering perspectives not just about humans and their various cultures, but equally in relation to plants and animals. So when we are studying anthropology, sociology, political science, we often talk about humans. But can we also think about a political science, a sociology, and an anthropology of plants and animals? Dr. Sophie argues that we can. And especially in the context of the Anthropocene, a term all of you are familiar with, and widespread ecological destruction and degeneration, we need to start thinking a little different about the world and the place of us human beings in this world. So Dr. Sophie's ethnographic and theoretical work is part of this turn in research and thinking. And I'm sure she will talk a great deal about these new kind of trends today. And I'm sure that Dr. Sophie's lecture will make all of us think and see human, plants, and animals and the relation between them different. So this is one reason why I'm so happy Dr. Sophie is with us today. But I'm also very pleased to have Dr. Sophie with us today for a more personal reason, which is that she is a close friend and she was my classmate in Oxford, where we both studied anthropology. Already back then, we knew that Dr. Sophie will climb great heights in life, and her work shows that we are all correct in thinking so. With these words, I would like to thank Dr. Sophie once again for being with us this afternoon and kindly request her to start her lecture.
Many thanks indeed, Jelle, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you also to Roderick for inviting me to present in the Skepseis series. And thanks to Cedrupla for facilitating the hour. Before I start, I want to acknowledge that I am speaking to you today from the customary lands of the Gadigal indigenous peoples here in Australia. I want to acknowledge the elders of the Gadigal, past, present, and emergent, and I want to pay my respects to their kin, both human, animal, vegetal, and elemental. So I'm Sophie Chao. I'm an environmental anthropologist and an interdisciplinary scholar, and most of my research in the last decade has focused on the intersections between indigeneity, ecology, capitalism, and justice in an age of radical environmental change, commonly known as the Anthropocene. In particular, I've been interested in the changing relationships between humans, animals, and plants in Indonesia, and particularly among indigenous peoples who are seeing vast areas of their lands and forests converted to monocrop oil palm plantations. In doing this research, I've been hugely inspired by theories and methods in the field of multi-species studies, which is what I'm going to focus on in today's talk. I'll begin by giving you a brief overview of the emergence of multi-species studies, together with some of the key principles, objectives, and methods of this current. Then we'll turn to some of the critiques of multi-species approaches and some of their limitations, and I'll close by discussing what I see as some potential ways forward for exploring an anthropology of life, to borrow Eduardo Cohn's words, that is not limited to the human, but also attends to human differences in the ways we understand, experience, and interact with the non-human world. And hopefully some of what I'll cover will complement the reading that I believe Roderick shared with you on multi-species studies and human rights, which I'd be very happy to discuss during the Q&A session. So I think it's important to bear in mind that this field of multi-species studies is relatively new. It's about a decade old, and so it's very much still in the making and experimental. The first iteration of the term multi-species ethnography was in a 2010 article that was published by the anthropologists Eben Kirksey and Stefan Hemreich in an article titled The Emergence of Multi-Species Ethnography. I'd encourage you to visit that piece as it lays out some of the basic paradigms and principles driving this more than human anthropology. But in sum, if we were to consider some of the key traits of this approach, multi-species studies, as Jelle outlined earlier, is an approach that is interested in understanding the agency, life worlds of non-human organisms with whom humans are profoundly, if often unconsciously, entangled with. These non-human organisms can include plants and animals, but also microbes, bacteria, fungi, and, as we have seen more recently, viruses. The idea with multi-species ethnography is to move away from nature-culture binaries or nature-culture dichotomies, and instead to think about what Donna Haraway calls nature cultures, in one word, right? Spaces in which the boundaries between the human, the animal, the machine, and the vegetal have irreducibly broken down. In this then, multi-species ethnography, it's very much part of a broader interdisciplinary current that some of you might have heard of, known as post-humanism. This approach is very much trying to push against what is called human exceptionalism, which is the idea that humans are better or superior in some way or another to non-human life forms, and instead to start to rethink the human as just one of many diverse forms of life within a much broader spectrum of animacy. Multi-species ethnographers, Eben Kirksey, Stefan Helmreich, myself included, are interested in thinking about multi-species processes as becomings, right? Continually transforming kinds of relations. So moving away from life as a form of being in static, bounded terms to multi-species life as a becoming, and more than that, a multi-species becoming with, in the sense that we are always becoming human through our relationships with non-human organisms. A central method of multi-species studies is what Eben Kirksey and others call arts of attentiveness. This means becoming curious about the natural world around us, looking around, not just ahead, trying to articulate through our senses and emotions what it means to share the world with other organisms and critters, and through that perhaps learning to care a little bit differently about the so many very species that are being driven to the brink of extinction and rendered vulnerable in the context of the Anthropocene. The idea with moving beyond the human to an anthropology of life is not to abandon the human, but rather also to thicken the human. By that I mean to look at the ways in which different human societies experience, conceptualize and interact with the natural world in historically, politically, geographically, and politically contextual kinds of ways. All of these kinds of questions, as you can imagine, have gained a sort of political and ethical urgency in the context of the sixth mass extinction that we are currently living through, one that is characterized by mass capitalistic extraction and what Deborah Bird-Rose has called a planetary unmaking. In this context, multi-species scholars are interested in the question of who benefits from interspecies relations. How can we rethink relations of power, violence, control, and domination across species lines? And alongside acknowledging the profound impacts of humans on nature, how do we learn to write nature in the active voice? Here I'm borrowing an expression from the eco-philosopher Val Plumwood, who invites us to rethink the way we write nature, so often framed as a passive, static backdrop to human activities. So if we're to dig into some of the methods of multi-species studies, I've outlined a few here that I'll take you through. The first is multi-sited research. So many multi-species scholars choose a particular organism that they're interested in and then follow it across space and time to see how its meaning, its ecology, and its materiality transforms across spatial and temporal contexts. A great example of this is Stefan Helmreich's book, Alien Ocean, in which he follows microbes from the deep seas across all manner of sites, across conservation contexts, tourist industries, and local communities to explore again how their biological and cultural life world transforms. Another great example of multi-sited, multi-species ethnography is Anna Singh's book, Mushroom at the End of the World, in which she follows the life of the matsutake mushroom, one of the world's most expensive fungi, all the way from post-capitalist Japan through to global supply chains, Siberian herders, and many other dispersed human communities. Alongside multi-sided approaches, many multi-species ethnographers adopt a multi-thematic approach. By this, I mean that they choose a particular idea or concept and then follow it across particular places and times. One example is Tom Van Doren's book, Flightways, in which he focuses on the practice and reality of extinction and unloved others who are being brought to the brink of disappearance in the context of the Anthropocene. And in this book, he traces extinction through the changing life worlds of 6 different bird species. Donna Haraway, another prominent multi-species scholar, adopts a similar thematic approach in her book, When Species Meet, in which she explores the meanings of dogs as companion species, as commodities, and as objects of scientific experimentation in global capitalist circuits. Thirdly, Edwin Kirksey's book, Emergent Ecologies, centers on ideas of hope. What he asks, how can we rethink hope in our relationships to non-human beings in the context of the Anthropocene? How can we unearth emergent ecologies in plantation landscapes, ruderal landscapes, and other places that have been decimated by capitalist and colonial expansion? The multi-species continues in the multidisciplinary approach of many of these scholars, myself included. Many will interweave, for instance, theories and methods derived from anthropology with philosophy, plant science, zoology, biology, history, biogenetics, biotechnology, and science and technology studies. The idea here being trying to approach the life of non-human beings through various disciplinary angles in order to understand them in a more holistic way. Stefan Helmreich's book, which I want to return to, for instance, cross-pollinates anthropology with genomics, bioinformatics, and remote sensing to track the ways in which microbes change both in matter and in meaning across space and time. Tom Van Doren, too, synthesizes anthropological methods with conservation science and evolutionary theory to rethink extinction across the deep time of geology and biology. Another great example of multidisciplinary ethnography is the book, The Multi-Species Salon, in which anthropologists collaborate with artists and biological scientists to illuminate how different organisms become entangled with humans in political, economic, and cultural systems. And a big part of this book is using art as a medium for rethinking multi-species entanglements. For instance, bio-art installations, living sculptures, multi-species collages, digital media, and all other kinds of funky experiments. Another central method in multi-species studies is using the senses to become curious and become attentive to the natural world. Eva Hayward is one multi-species scholar that I have really enjoyed thinking with. She works with deep sea cup corals, and she develops this idea or this practice of fingery eyes to try to understand cup corals that do not react to sound or to sight, but that react to touch. And so she talks about the practice of becoming engaged with corals through the senses, through her fingers, getting to understand their vibrations, their movements, and their pulsations as a way of fingery-eyely knowing them. In my own work on plants in West Papua, I've also thought about sensory approaches to the natural world by working with indigenous peoples who very much understand the landscape as something that you come to know through touch and also through sound of birds, of water, of the wind, of sago fronds swaying as climates change. And another key method here, alongside multisensory approaches, has been multi-species scholars who are working closely with biological scientists and other natural scientists and trying to understand how does a multi-species world look like from the perspective of the hard scientists. A great example is Natasha Myers, who self-coins herself as a planthropologist because she works on plants. And a lot of her work is actually talking to plant scientists and trying to work through Western scientific taxonomies and epistemologies of plant worlds to try to bring in a political and ethical angle to objective secular scientific research. Now, all of these methods I've just described to you are part of a bigger practice that Tom Van Doren and Deborah Bode-Rose, two prominent multi-species scholars, call writing lively ethnographies. So why ethnographies? The term ethnography, which is more often used in anthropology, is derived from two words, ethnos and graph, or the writing of an ethnos. Ethnos usually refers to ethnic groups or peoples, in other words, human communities. Ethos, Van Doren and Rose tell us, is different. Ethos simply means a way of life. So ways of life, they argue, are something that not just humans hold, but also a whole range of other than human beings. Therefore, they argue that we should be writing stories about evolving ways of life of diverse human and more than human organisms, because it is not just humans who have an ethos. Telling lively ethnographies, they argue, is a way of knowing, engaging, and storytelling the natural world that recognizes the meaningful lives of non-human others and therefore also enhances our own capacity as humans to respond ethically and responsibly towards them. As a result, what we're trying to work towards here are fleshy stories, deeply sensory, situated, ethographic accounts of the natural world that can hopefully make us care more about these worlds in the context of mass extinctions. Before I turn to some of the challenges or limitations of multi-species approaches, I wanted to highlight a few key terms that were mentioned in the article that that Roderick shared and that I'd be happy to discuss also in the Q&A. These are key terms that you will see emerging often in the multi-species literature. The first four are from Donna Haraway, who is one of the key figures in this interdisciplinary current. So encounter is a key term for Haraway. Much of her work has pushed against Marxist scholarship on exchange value and use value when we think about commodities. Haraway argues that we need to think about species not just as commodities or as things, but actually as encounters, and that it is in the face-to-face sensory gaze or interaction that we have with the non-human world that we can learn to become curious and care about this world differently. Haraway also develops the term companion species to talk about non-human beings. She tells us that companion comes from the words cum panis, or sharing bread together. In other words, we always share the world and its resources with non-human entities, and this invites us to rethink the kinds of violence and mastery and control that we often assume or naturalize as a human species towards non-human beings. I've touched on the term nature culture here, another Harawayan term. It's a simple move. She's simply putting together two words that usually have a space between them. But for Haraway, getting rid of that space is meaningful. Why? Because it, invites us to stop thinking about nature and culture as two separate, bounded things, and instead to think about the ways in which nature and culture are actually constantly fashioning, shaping, and interacting with one another. A fourth key concept that I want to draw your attention to is situated knowledge, another Haraway term. A lot of Haraway's work has been pushing against this idea that we can ever really fully understand or know non-human animals, plants, microbes, and viruses, not just because we're not of the same species, but also because the worlds of these species change across particular contexts, both spatial and temporal. So all knowledge, both about humans and non-humans, is always contextual, or in Haraway's terms, situated. The word emergence from Kirksey is also gaining prominence. This is a term that is often used by multi-species scholars to examine ecologies that are actually flourishing even in the midst of capitalist destruction and extinction and loss. There's a strong message of hope in these discourses using emergence, that these multi-species stories are not just about death and killability, they're also about new kinds of life, new forms of multi-species relations that might point to new planetary ecosystems in the near and distant future. A few more terms that are relevant here. The first is interaction. This is a fantastic term that I've been thinking with a lot in the last few years. It's from a quantum theorist, believe it or not, called Karen Barad. And this term is important for us to think with because it's basically trying to push against a very close term, which is interaction. So many of us will know the word interaction. Interaction is doing something different. What's it doing different? Well, interaction, like international, assumes a relationship between two separate things, right? International relations, a relation between two separate distinct states. Interaction is different because it is suggesting that, in fact, things do not exist before their relationship arises, right? So they are not interactive, they are interactive. And so by that token, no organism, human or non-human, exists before it comes into a relationship with another entity, either human or non-human. So it's a deep form of relational thinking. Human exceptionalism, I touched on that very briefly earlier in explaining that broader context of post-humanist theory that multi-species studies sits within. Human exceptionalism is something that many multi-species scholars critique and push against. It is simply this idea prevalent in Western philosophies of the more than human world, that the human species is somehow better or superior to other life forms and therefore exercises the right to control, discipline, or exploit these non-human life forms. By pushing against human exceptionalism, multi-species scholars are trying to flatten these hierarchies by in fact showing that humans can only ever be or become through their interdependencies with non-human beings. Care, another central concept in multi-species scholarship, but more specifically the idea that many forms of care that we think we enact to non-human companion species are always often tied to particular forms of violence, right? Puig de la Bellacasa and Van Doren have been the key theorists of violent care, and many of their works point to care for non-human beings as threefold. Care, they argue, is an ethical disposition, it's also a practical labor, and it's an affective or an emotional condition of being. but often the care that we enact towards non-humans is not innocent, right? It is often interested, and it's often driven by human-centric interests rather than necessarily the well-being or the flourishing of our other than human companion species. Mastery, very closely linked to human exceptionalism, has also been a widely critiqued paradigm, particularly in Western philosophies and political theory, going back to this idea of, the assumed legitimacy of human mastery over non-human beings as a result of our presumed superiority. And finally, Anna Singh has done some fascinating work in the sphere of ferality. And this is a really interesting and eclectic subfield of multi-species studies that is actually looking at situations where non-human beings that humans think that they control or master or discipline are actually escaping our forms of authority. Examples of this might include pandemics, pest epidemics in monocrop plantations, the swine flu, COVID-19. So contexts where in fact non-human beings are exercising their own kind of resistance and agency in ways that are subverting or sabotaging human projects of mastery. So those are some key terms that I'm happy to return to in the discussion, and a bit of outline of some of the methods and the principles of multi-species studies. I now really want to spend some time looking at the challenges or limitations perhaps of this emergent current. And I do this because this has been a large part of more recent scholarship reacting to or responding to more than human anthropologies. So the first thing I want to point out is that attention to the non-human is not a new phenomenon, right? It's often phrased as such in multi-species scholarship, but as I'm sure many of you know, there is an abundant body of literature in anthropology and cognate disciplines that has explored the life worlds and relations of humans to their environment. Just as importantly, perhaps I would say more importantly, very little multi-species scholarship engages or even acknowledges indigenous philosophies, practices, and protocols surrounding the more than human world. Now, this matters on two levels. First, in the sense that many indigenous peoples around the world, including those that I have worked with in Indonesia, have always understood the world to be multi-species and have always lived by an ethos of respect and reverence towards non-human beings. However, their theories, their perspectives are often obscured or excluded from global north-centered multi-species scholarship. Another issue that's been raised with this attempt to decenter the human is the risk of what I have called in one of my works, non-human exceptionalism. So what does that mean? Well, multi-species scholars are trying to counter human exceptionalism, this idea that humans are superior or better to non-human beings. But that also comes with a risk, right? It comes with the risk of making our stories about non-human beings whilst also neglecting the fact that in many parts of the world today and in the past, many human societies continue to be treated as subhuman and even non-human and therefore killable before the law as a result of colonial systems, racial discrimination, and so forth, right? So the question here is one that many critical race scholars have raised, is the ethical question of foregrounding non-human lives when so many human lives to this day continue to be rendered killable, non-grievable, and very much disposable under extractive colonial and racial systems. Another critique that's been raised with more than human approaches has been the kind of flattening of the human, right? I used the term post-humanism earlier. Many people assume, wrongly, unfortunately, that this means we are post the human, right? That the human doesn't matter. We've moved on, and that's very problematic. Not just because of the issues of race that I've just mentioned, but also because, as anthropologists in the room will know, what counts as the human, what constitutes the human, is itself incredibly diverse, contextual, and situated, right? So the question here is, how do we balance the diversity of ways we understand non-human beings with the diversity of ways in which diverse human beings understand the diversity of non-human beings? That was a very long and convoluted sentences, but what I'm trying to do is to make you think about the problems of flattening or singularizing or reducing the human as a singular category. Another big challenge, of course, one that I continue to think about is, okay, we're humans trying to understand non-human beings, but how can we really know the world of a virus? How can I really exceed the perceptual world of a tree? How can I ever know what a dog thinks or why a dog does what it does, right? There are biological, cognitive, behavioral limitations to our capacity to know the human world. Many scholars have also challenged the tendency of multi-species scholars to take as its premise of knowledge secular science. So by this I mean, botany, biological sciences, the natural sciences, and the physical sciences. Now, of course, as I'm sure many of you are aware, what we know as secular science is very much a product of Western philosophies and heritages themselves forged through processes of colonial capitalism. So there's an ethical issue here when we take as our central body of sort of knowledge a particular form of science that then obscures other forms of science, including indigenous science, which does in fact exist. Alongside this question of whose science counts or whose knowledge or way of knowing counts is this issue of scales and terms of inquiry. So this is a question that's been raised that I've written about, which is particularly important when we think about the species part of multi-species. How do we really go about researching species? Do we start with an individual organism? Do we start with a community of that organism? Do we think about the species as a whole on a planetary level? And in what ways is the very idea of a species itself a very Western scientific concept, right? Many non-Western societies do not relate to the non-human world through the concept of species. They have other idioms, kinship, family members, enemies, prey. There are a whole range of other ways that we can think about non-human life outside of the scientific category of species. And then that brings us to start to problematize the limits of multi-species to life itself. Right? When we think about species, we think about life forms, forms of bios, right? Biology. But what about oceans, rivers, soils, rocks, mountains, climates, spirits, ancestors, ghosts? All of these are also, in many parts of the world, very consequential and meaningful actors in more than human worlds. So one of the challenges of multi-species is that it's trying to expand the scope of anthropology beyond the human, but it is still restricting its objects of analysis to what science considers a life form, right? An animate being. So maybe we should start to think beyond bios to encompass these elemental, geological, and in some cases, non-secular or spiritual entities like ghosts, like ancestors, like spirits. Finally, multi-species flourishing. A lot of this multi-species work has been calling for relationships of care, love, and kinship with non-human beings. But there's been less work looking at violence within multi-species relations, right? Including violence in, traditional or indigenous societies where violence is always part of multi-species dynamics and where multi-species relations, as Radhika Govindarajan, a wonderful multi-species scholar, calls decidedly uninnocent. So this is a question of finding a balance between telling stories of hope and love and care, but also telling stories of violence, of diminishment, and of killability in the context of the sixth mass extinction. All of these challenges, I think, sit within a broader political and philosophical question, which is, what are these multi-species stories for and who do they serve? Are we writing here for academics? Are we writing for policymakers? Are we writing for the corporations who are primarily responsible for ecological degradation? What are the stakes in these stories? And if we're going to tell lively, fleshy ethnographies, how do we also make them impactful and engaged so that they can in some way transform the world that they are storying? So this is a political question, which I think is not limited to multi-species studies in its relevance. So looking forward, my final few words. As you will have probably gleaned from some of the critiques that I've brought out, I think that moving forward, multi-species futures and future multi-species studies requires requires a kind of engagement with these sort of criticisms. The first would be there needs to be a better acknowledgement of the many precedents of research in human-environment relations, both in anthropology and cognate fields. There is a critical need to decolonize multi-species studies that today still largely is produced by global North scholars based on realities in the global South, right? How do we even that playing field to engage Indigenous and global South scholars and communities, not just as research subjects, but as co-producers of knowledge? And on that, I would love to hear your thoughts, particularly. There needs to be a greater problematization of the relationship between race, culture, and species, right? If we're moving beyond nature-culture divide, how then do we account for human difference, interhuman violence, and then ecological violence and its cultural representations and framings? Interrogating what we mean by the human, I think, is really important, rather than assuming that from the outset, and also interrogating whether the species per se is the most useful analytic or lens through which to look at more than human worlds, as compared to, for instance, companions or kin or others. This idea of entanglement that is really prominent also needs to be unpacked, both in terms of its aspects of violence, care, responsibility. And I think going back to the last point that I was making, there's a real need, or certainly a growing call from Indigenous scholars and post-colonial scholars to politicize multi-species studies. That is to say, to apply our findings about more than human worlds to try to effect a change or transformation of some sort at some level in the ways in which human institutions and communities interact or engage with these rapidly vulnerabilized more than human worlds. I want to close here with what I see as, one of the most exciting directions that multi-species studies is taking, and Roderick will know about this, and this is multi-species justice. And this is a project that I've been involved in with a whole bunch of peers across Global North and Global South institutions. And what we're trying to do with this project is to take some of the ideas, theories, and methods that I've described to you in this talk from multi-species studies, but to transpose them to explore multi-species justice, so justice beyond the human. What are we trying to do with this? Well, we're trying to problematize the very human-centric and individual ways in which justice is understood in dominant Western political theory and philosophies. We're trying to think about justice both inside the realm of the law or the juridical, but also outside in the praxis of everyday life and routine. We're trying to think about what it means to think about justice across different scales and species. And also we're trying to think about how to bring multi-species justice or justice for more than human beings into relationship with multiple other kinds of justices: Indigenous justice, environmental justice, climate justice, racial justice, food justice, intergenerational justice, restorative justice, and many, many more in this growing ecology of justices. Some of the key questions driving this project, which is a political one as much as an intellectual one, is, well, first of all, who are the subjects of multi-species justice? Can a plant, an animal, a virus, an ocean be a non-human legal person? And if so, how do we then rethink legal rights and responsibilities if non-human beings too can be subjects of justice? And then perhaps the more thorny question that we're thinking about, particularly in the COVID context, is if we're trying to think about justice for non-human beings, then what do we do with destructive non-human subjects of justice? Viruses, invasive species, pests, and microbes that undermine human livability. If non-human beings have rights, then do they also have responsibilities? Can we rethink punishment and punitive justice when we're talking about a plant or an animal? So really exciting, very experimental, I guess, in some extent, cutting edge questions that we're asking together to try to rethink justice itself in a more than human and decolonial lens. I'll end it there. If you do want to find out more about this multi-species justice project, I'm co-organizing a wonderful series of talks online with my collaborators, Eben Kirksey and Karen Bolander. And you can follow these talks online every 2 weeks. There's streamed on YouTube Live, featuring a fantastic series of speakers, including Donna Haraway, Tom Van Doren, Evan Kirksey, and many others that I've mentioned. So you're more than welcome to join the space if you're interested. And I will leave it at that with an abundance of references. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. So I've opened this platform for any questions. We'll take like 2-3 questions. 3 questions. Those who are joining online, you can type the questions through messages.
Can I ask a question?
Sure, Yella. I just wanted to add, given the brevity of my talk, I didn't have much chance to talk about my research in West Papua. So if any of you want to ask me questions about that, I would be very happy to answer. But Yella, please.
I was exactly going to do that. And in some of your writing, you talk about plant personhood, right? Could you explain to all of us how a plant can be a person and what kind of evidence you have to justify that a plant is as much a person as a human being can be a person?
Thank you for getting us started, Yella. Yes, so a lot of my work, as you say, is trying to invite us and in conversation with other scholars to think about plants as particular kinds of persons. So persons, certainly in anthropological discourse, has often primarily been used to talk about humans, right? And persons are different to organisms in that persons have a social, cultural life, right? And that is this sort of, ontology of a person. So what am I trying to do with plants? Well, my research in West Papua among indigenous communities very much brought me to understand that the category of person is in no way limited to human persons. Plants are also persons in a whole range of different ways, right? First of all, they have a social and cultural life in the sense that they are part of a society of nature in which they interact with a whole range of other species, humans, but also insects, birds, wind, elements, waterways, mammals, and so forth. So their society is already, from the outset, a more than human society, animated by a whole range of more than human persons. Plants are also persons in the sense that Marind give them individual names, and often these names are based on shared growth or reproduction of a particular plant with a particular child or infant within the community that was born at the same time and who will grow together with this plant and therefore in some ways share a multi-species personhood with this plant that they bear the name of. Plants are also persons from Marind in that they have a legible story inscribed on their bark. So one of the, I talked about multisensory methods. One of the main ways that Marind come to know the story of palm trees in particular is by touching and observing their trunk. All of the little nooks and crannies and fissures and textures and relief of this bark are telling you something about this organism's story. When it was born, when it experienced a flood, when it was affected by a drought, when it almost succumbed to a fire, when it became the place where an important ritual or event happened within the community, when it became sick, when it became infested by insects and microbes and so forth. So reading the trunk itself reveals this incredible dermatology of existence that is all about the relationships of that particular plant with the elements with humans, and with a whole range of others. And so that's why I'm trying to think about plants as persons, is to foreground the ways in which they have biological, historical, and cultural life worlds that are legible in ways that I came to understand by learning to read their skin, quite literally, palm reading, if you wish, through the eyes of indigenous communities who become with these plants as part of a much broader multi-species society of life forms.
Hello, ma'am. Thank you for doing this for us. I have a question for you, ma'am. So when you try to define, when you look at a plant or animal species, a certain species, when you study it, where do you lean most on? Because you said you studied.
I'm sorry, I think I missed the second half of that question. The connection went a bit haywire. Could you just repeat the question?
You talked about there are multiple aspects when you study a species, be it a plant or an animal. So where do you lean on? Which aspect do you draw most from? You said culturally, there's political aspects, scientific. You talk about scientific aspects. Where do you lean most on, and how do you start defining a life of a species?
That's a brilliant and brilliantly challenging question. So thank you for that. I think a lot of my research has been trying to hold different ways of knowing in suspension with one another, right? I'm an anthropologist by training, and a lot of my work, is engaging with ways of knowing species from anthropology, but also from conservation science, from the plant sciences, from animal ethology or behavioral studies. I'm also really interested in thinking about species through environmental history, right? So looking at species today within much broader or longer standing temporal processes. And a lot of my work as an anthropologist has been looking at, trying to rethink species from the lens of indigenous philosophies, practices, and protocols, right? Communities who, as I was saying, have always recognized the interdependencies of human and non-human beings, and who have their own scientific paradigms for relating and understanding to these non-human beings. And this is not limited to theory or concepts, as much of scholarship is. These are lived multi-species relations. This is the everyday, right? Indigenous peoples that I work with are putting this into practice in their everyday life. So I would say that in my practice, I have always tried to foreground or to center indigenous science, indigenous ways of knowing. And I call it indigenous science because many of my indigenous friends don't like when it's called traditional ecological knowledge. It is science, it is empirical, it is verifiable. So they're making an important, political claim here. And so indigenous science has always been at the heart for me. And then bringing in sort of, other disciplines like history, anthropology, geography, feminist studies to kind of inform or to add nuance or a global perspective to the particular situated realities that my fieldwork has explored in West Papua. But it's always a difficult balancing act, deciding whose voice you will prioritize, which disciplines have a bigger say, right? And I think these questions about who you're in conversation with, they're intellectual questions, but they're also ethical and political questions in the context of this need to decolonize multi-species studies from its kind of global north focus and knowledge production ethos.
Thank you, ma'am. I can sit in front. Yeah. No, I think Sebastian is sit down. Yeah. Yeah.
So we all know that while doing our ethnographic work, it takes a certain amount of time. So while you were undergoing your research, how long did you take? And what were some of the difficulties and challenges that you faced while you were undergoing your research?
Thank you for that question. Yes, goodness knows that the pandemic has made any kind of fieldwork plan particularly difficult. But even before then, I suppose there were always challenges in terms of doing this kind of research. So I spent about a year doing fieldwork in West Papua, and before that, I used to work for a human rights organization in the UK, and I had spent something like half a year in West Papua as a human rights, advocate, documenting human rights abuses and dispossession and indigenous disempowerment and displacement caused by large-scale deforestation and the expansion of monocrop oil palm plantations. So I had already these, very strong relationships with the communities that I then had the privilege to live with and think with and learn from over the course of this 1 year in the field. I think one of the biggest challenges for me at the beginning, and this goes back to the question about personhood that Yella raised, for the first 6 months of my research, often people would be talking about people, right? Describing them as kind or gentle, or just talking about persons as transforming and telling their stories. And it took me 6 months to realize that half the time when I thought they were talking about other humans in the communities, they were actually talking about plants. And they were actually talking about animals, right? So for me, that was a big challenge because I had to completely rethink the way I approached the environment and humans as two separate things, and actually start to really take seriously the possibilities that plants and animals and landscapes are also agentive persons and consequential actors. So that was kind of a big, cognitive cultural shift for me. I think another challenge I want to point out here is that the place where I was working, as I said, is a place that is ongoingly colonized. West Papua has been colonized by Indonesia since the 1960s. It's a place where people are facing, high levels of military presence, state discrimination, violence, interrogations, incarceration, torture. It's an ongoing slow motion genocide that is happening in West Papua. So for me as a foreign researcher, one of the biggest things on my mind was how do I do this research about non-human worlds whilst also being really, really aware that the human beings I am learning from are themselves incredibly vulnerable to state corporate forms of violence and terror in many ways, right? So that was a moral hazard for me that was always on my mind. And a lot of my research was very much following the advice and the guidance of the communities themselves as to when it was right for me to be there and when it was not, so that my presence would not exacerbate or intensify the pressures that they already face from encroaching corporations and a very much, hegemonic sort of colonizing state. So those are some of the practical and epistemic challenges I think I faced in my research. But in many ways, my research never really ended because a lot of my work was about palm oil and or oil palm, which is the plant. And as some of you might know, palm oil is a very, very ubiquitous, it's a vegetable oil that is found in so many different products, from candies to ice cream to shampoo to soaps and so forth. It's on, I think it's like half of all products in supermarket shelves. It's everywhere. So in some ways, my fieldwork never ended because I was always surrounded by palm oil, no matter where I went. If I was in Papua, whether I was in Australia like I am now, or if I was in Europe, palm oil was always kind of there. It was always haunting and demanding that I continue to think about the trouble with this cash crop and this lucrative and ubiquitous oil. So I think one of the challenges or opportunities with multi-species projects is that your field is never bounded, because whatever species or element you're following is also always somewhere else and connected in one way or another to the particular place that you consider or call the field, right? So thinking about partial connections and connections through species and commodities, I think, has been one of the most generative sides of doing this more than human anthropology.
So I have one question. Can you please elaborate on getting to know plants with regard to your research in West Papua? So how do one get to know plants, for instance, grass? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, getting to know plants. So let me think. When I like to tell you how I started out thinking when I did my fieldwork and then how I transformed, because when I speak now, it can sound like this is all taken for granted knowledge, but believe me, it was years of apprenticeship that I received from my friends in the field that helped me get to know plants. So, when I started doing my research, I went out with a good, strong training in ethnobotany and ethnozoology. So I was interested in learning all the names and all the categories and all the species of plants in this particular part of West Papua. But I very soon realized that my friends were not interested in lists of names, right? They were not interested in categories of species and what name and label matches what plant. And one day, one of my friends told me, if I want to know you, if you want to know me, I can tell you my name, but what else do you know about me if I just tell you my name? And it made me think, that's true. If someone tells you their name, that's all you know, right? And so she told me, you mustn't ask for names. You should ask for stories. You need to ask about stories. And stories, I think, are one of the central ways in which I got to know plants. By stories, I mean the myths and oral traditions of Papuan peoples, where they describe the origins, the ways of life, and the relationships of plants to other species. Storytelling also takes the form of song, when people sing about the appearance or the behavior or the transformations of a particular plant that they have encountered in the forest or that their ancestors planted in the near or distant past. Papuan people that I worked with also get to know plants through this practice that they call sharing wetness. So sharing wetness means sharing your sweat and your tears with plants and their sap or their resin or their fluids through very physical exchanges, touching the trunk, pulling the leaves, barking the fronds, and so forth. Engaging physically with the tree, you're exchanging substances, you're exchanging fluids with the plant in a way that really speaks to a very, very tactile, fleshy kind of intimacy between plants and people, right? So a lot of this is not ideal cognitive sort of concept-driven ways of knowing. They are ways of knowing that are grounded in the fleshy materiality and touchiness of what it means to live with and to encounter plants in everyday life. And finally, a third big important way of getting to know plants, certainly when it came to oil palm, which was one of the key plants that I was thinking with, is practicing this multi-sited approach, right? So a lot of my work that's forthcoming actually explores how oil palm became this incredibly prolific and controversial cash crop that it is today. It wasn't always the case. For many, many, many centuries, it was a semi-wild plant that grew in West Africa, and now it's become the most prevalent cash crop in the world. So how did this happen historically, culturally, politically, economically, right? So that's another way you can get to know plants, is by looking at their multi-sided career as plants and as capital across space and time through these sort of global circuits of consumption, production, and so forth, right? So a geography of plant life that is not about one particular place, but is actually trying to make a patchwork of different places and times to create a more holistic or multifaceted image of what that plant is, and possibly also what that plant knows.
Thank you so much. So with the interest of time, if there are any further questions, we'll be sending it through email to Mrs. Chao, and I'll hand it over to the for the vote of thanks. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your attention, for your questions. And yes, just to reiterate what Sadrupla said, please do feel free to get in touch if you have any questions. You can also visit my website, morethanhumanworlds.com, and I would love to continue the conversation. Thank you so much, and thank you to Jelle and to Roderick for making this space possible.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Vitan, and I deem it a great honor and privilege to propose the vote of thanks on this memorable occasion of such an intellectually stimulating gathering. I would like to thank our guest lecturer, Ms. Sophie, for enlightening us with her knowledge. Today's lecture was full of knowledge and interesting information. I am pretty sure this knowledge will help us in our studies and in our future as well. Once again, I would like to thank Ms. Sophie for making time for us despite her busy schedule. I would also like to thank Dr. Jelle for being with us virtually. I want to thank all those who worked hard to make this event possible. And last but not the least, I thank all the lecturers and students out here for your presence and making this function a resounding success. Thank you very much.
Thank you.